Total war engulfs the lives of those in its path and in its wake. It brings invasion and occupation as cities, towns, and villages fall. The occupying forces face those determined to resist. The boundaries between soldier and non-combatant are blurred as villages and homes are burned to the ground as warning or reprisal. In the Second World War, combatant nations drew upon the labor, food, and raw materials of the lands they occupied in order to fuel their war effort. People starved, people died. In the name of total victory, the war in Europe began with the German invasion of Poland on the 1st of September 1939. That found Poland ill-prepared. Warned by Britain and France that mobilization might provoke an attack, troops were not mobilized until August 30th. By then it was too late. Only a third of Polish troops were in position on the 1st of September. Britain and France made clear that any attack on Poland and any assault on Polish territorial sovereignty would be a casualties belly, would be a reason for them to go to war. Honoring their commitment to protecting Poland, Great Britain and France declared war on Germany on the 3rd of September. At the Chamber of Deputies in Paris, scenes are tense, geined arms on guard, a sense of fateful decision among the people as France declares war on Germany. On the 17th of September, the Soviet Union, allied with Germany under the Molotov-Ribbentrop Non-Aggression Pact, invaded Poland. 10 days later, Warsaw surrendered. The Polish army resisted until early October. Prisoners of war, more than 100,000 of them captured when the city fell. Elsewhere in Poland, the Germans took myriads of prisoners, and the internal lines trudging along symbolized the swift destruction of a nation, the tragedy of Poland. Poland was cleft in two, divided between Germany and the Soviet Union under the secret provisions of their pact. The years of occupation that followed profoundly affected the fabric of Polish society. After the invasion of Poland, the momentum of the war slowed. Winter stalled plans for a further German advance, and the Blitzkrieg, or sitting war as it was known in Germany, began. But for these brief months, the nations in Germany's path were safe. They did not stay safe for long. Lightning War cracked over Europe in April 1940. Norway and Denmark were invaded. Denmark was quickly occupied. Norway held out until June. Luxembourg was occupied on the 10th of May 1940. The Netherlands surrendered on the 14th, Belgium on the 28th. One after another, nations fell to the sweeping German advance. The extent which Blitzkrieg was a revolutionary idea could be debated, but it was certainly unusual in the speed with which it was unleashed, and for France and the Low Countries, their armies, Holland, Belgium, France, and indeed the British Expeditionary Force, were all uniquely vulnerable to this type of attack. Anticipating trench warfare, the French prepared the defensive Maginot Line, but the attack had not come from the predicted direction. The Germans moved their armored divisions through the Ardennes forest, a feat the French had thought impossible. There are a number of reasons that underpin German success. First of all, we have to accept that the German army was very good at what it was intended to do, which was to fight rapid encirclement operations, whereby armor and motorized mechanized infantry would encircle slower-moving infantry formations with some degree of motorized artillery and with air support as well. After a brief campaign, France signed an armistice agreement with Germany on the 22nd of June 1940. I think there was a great sense of humiliation and shock. France, which had, emerged victorious from the First World War, had been overrun in 6 weeks. On the other hand, there was a sense of relief. They say their reaction was, "Oof, thank God we're not going to be in a 4-year trench war like we're last time." So there was a sense of humiliation, but a sense of relief. What happened then was an attempt to return to normal life, but those under occupation had to adjust to a new kind of normal. When the Germans arrived, the clocks, for example, were set to German time. There were regulations and curfews. There were swastikas on all the public buildings. So people had to adjust, and they had to learn how to deal with a new way of life. You came across Germans on the streets, in cafes and bars, in shops. There was a notion that you had to avoid their gaze. If you passed them in the street, you would ignore them, and yet people had to get on with them. People did business with them. They were buying things. France became locked into the German war economy under the terms of the Franco-German armistice. France was divided into two zones, a German-occupied zone in the north that included the Atlantic and Channel coasts, and a French zone in the south, under the control of a regime that took its name from the spa town where it was headquartered, Vichy. The Germans needed France in 1940. It needed France's cooperation. It needed it to be quiet, to be ordered, and the best way of getting that was by working through a national government. But it was not a democratic government. The Vichy government was a dictatorship. The Vichy government abolished the parliament. Parties didn't function. It was a dictatorship with all powers concentrated in one man, Marshal Pétain. The Vichy regime imposed a new set of values on the nation. Life, even outside the German-occupied zone, was different. The great motto of the Vichy regime was work, family, and fatherland. And there was also a kind of exclusion, so there were the good people and the bad people, and the bad people were basically Jews, communists, and Freemasons, and if you happened to be one of those, you would be purged from public life and run at risk of being imprisoned.
The German occupation of France was planned. The invasion and occupation of Greece, however, was not part of Hitler's plan. Italy invaded Greece from Albania in October 1940. The Italians expected an easy victory, but Greek forces pushed the Italians back. The British supported their efforts, bombing Albania and neutralizing the Italian navy. Hitler needed the region to be stable before he could launch his assault on the Soviet Union, and so, reluctantly, he moved to support his faltering ally. In April 1941, German divisions invaded Greece and Yugoslavia. Despite their best efforts, the Allied troops could not hold out against the Germans. Back at their base after their heroic fight in Greece, RAF personnel, Australian troops, and troops from Britain look anything but downhearted. By June 1941, Greece had fallen and was under a tripartite German, Italian, and Bulgarian occupation. Resources were soon put to use to fuel Germany's total war. Greece was also compelled to pay for the costs of occupation. In some parts of the country, the farmers had to give 60% of the wheat crop to the Germans. The eggs, the meat, everything. This resulted in hyperinflation, a black market, prices going up, severe unemployment, and incredible famine. The 1941 famine killed as many as 100,000 people. As a result of all the measures brought in by the Germans, Greeks were dying in the streets. In Athens, there were lots of bodies. One count was there were 300 bodies found a day in Greece, bloated and black from famine, just dropping dead where they were in the streets. Germany withdrew from Greece in October 1944. The Italians had signed an armistice in September 1943. But the withdrawal did not bring peace. The occupation created political division. In 1946, Greece fell into a savage civil war. At 4 o'clock in the afternoon of the 26th of September, troops known as Land Forces Adriatic went ashore. Unopposed anyway, we can well imagine how glad the Greeks were to see them. The cynical alliance between the Soviet Union and Germany was shredded in June 1941. Operation Barbarossa, the German invasion of the Soviet Union, was ideologically motivated. It was underpinned by Hitler's desire for Lebensraum, living space that would make room for Germans in the Soviet Union and drive Jewish and Slavic populations from their land. Despite the 1939 German-Soviet Pact, Stalin was well aware Germany would turn against the Soviet Union and had been preparing for war. Stalin was surprised by how fast the Germans were able to basically defeat the Western powers and how quickly the French succumbed. He understood that the Soviet Union needed more time to mobilize and be ready to meet a German attack. The irony, of course, is the balance of forces was much more in favor of the Soviet Union in the summer of 1941 when Germany attacked. From the outset, Hitler made clear the war against the Soviet Union was different. It was a war of annihilation. On the 30th of March 1941, he told his generals that the war against Russia cannot be conducted in a knightly fashion. Rather, it was to be fought with unprecedented, unmerciful, and unrelenting harshness. Now, after this conference, Halder, the chief of the Army General Staff, sets to work implementing Hitler's version of this new war. And the two most important orders are the Martial Jurisdiction Decree and the Commissar Order. Now, the Martial Jurisdiction Decree stipulates that German soldiers cannot be prosecuted for war crimes in the East. That is a fundamental change, and it basically grants them carte blanche to do as they wish in the East. The other one is the Commissar Order, and the Commissar Order stipulates that as low as a lieutenant, not only can he, must kill Soviet commissars when they are captured. As the Germans advanced, civilians in the Soviet Union were confronted with destruction and brutality at the hands of the Soviet government as well. The Red Army enacted a scorched earth policy as they withdrew. Resources which might be of use to the advancing Germans, roads, railways, food supplies, were destroyed. Hundreds of thousands of tons of grain and agricultural products were burned as a result of the policy denying food supplies not only to the advancing Germans, but the civilians left behind. Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union served a purpose beyond the annihilation of communism and Soviet Jewry. A victory in the Soviet Union would secure more land and raw resources. Total war requires war materials. Occupation of defeated nations was an effective way to obtain them. There was a strategic calculus in there, and the strategic calculus was we're running out of raw materials. The United States eventually will come into the war. The idea then was, well, we take over the entire Soviet Union. That will make us strong enough to then conduct war against the United States. But that whole calculus assumes that you can simply take over the Soviet Union. That was a completely crazy idea. The Germans really never had a chance. The Soviet industrial capacity was also a potential resource for Germany. The Soviet Union undertook a mass evacuation of the factories. Without these vital resources, the Soviet Union's total war effort may well have been lost. The move also inhibited Germany's opportunity to use them. This is very much an ad hoc crisis management response, and they do that fairly successfully. Although, of course, a lot of waste is produced, as one could imagine. But this is the sort of stuff the Stalinist regime was very good at. Emergency measures, large scale, often very improvised. To give you some idea of just how big the evacuation is, in the course of 1941, the German army will take over a huge portion of the Western Soviet Union. This incorporates about 32,000 industrial enterprises. Now, of those 32,000, only 2,500 will actually be evacuated. But off that 2,500, 1,500 are what we would class major industrial enterprises, and they are overwhelmingly military production. The fighting did not pause while the evacuation took place. The war raged on while the Soviets tried to coordinate moving innumerable factories and entire workforces. It's extremely chaotic. They don't know where the Germans are striking next, and although they don't have a highly developed strategic capacity, they're still knocking out railroads, destroying trains. Trains are lost. It's incredibly chaotic. Because if there's one thing that the Red Army needs, and the evacuation depends on, is Soviet rail. 1,360 major industrial plants were ultimately moved, staffed by some 16.5 million workers. They worked 11.5-hour days, 6 days a week on starvation rations. The evacuation of people and industry
allowed the Soviet Union to not only maintain but increase its war production. By the end of 1942, when the Germans occupied more than 1 million square miles of territory, Soviet production thrived. Tank and artillery production increased fivefold compared to 1941. The output of rifles quadrupled. The invasion of the Soviet Union was also meant to open up a potential source of food. A hunger plan was developed to redirect Soviet food supplies to German soldiers and civilians.
The hunger plan is the dream child of a food official called Herbert Bacher, who is your typical Schreibtischtäter. He sits there in his little uniform at his desk and comes up with really gruesome plans. And this is very typical of the way the National Socialist policy works. A memo on the hunger plan outlined that food harvested in the Ukraine would be diverted from towns and cities in northern and central Russia to German troops and civilians in the Reich.
And then in the orders that are given out to the army, who are supposed to implement this plan, they're told you must harden your heart against the suffering that you will see, because it's for the German citizens at home who are going to be fed enough. You mustn't give even a piece of bread to the starving Russians. They understood the implications of the plan. People would starve to death. Another SS officer writes in sort of euphoric terms about the way in which we're going to see mass hunger and mass starvation and mass death on a scale that you've never seen it before. So they quite coldly and calculatedly intend to murder many more millions of people than were actually murdered, in the Holocaust. The hunger plan was not the only policy created to starve occupied nations for the benefit of the Reich. The general plan for the East and its implementation beginning in Poland led to widespread eviction of Polish people from their homes. It sounded innocuous on paper. Ethnic Germans would move into agricultural towns, live in German-style houses with cottage gardens filled with German plants and trees. Some would work in agriculture. The remainder is craftsmen or in the public or commercial sector supporting the agricultural sector. But to achieve this apparent utopia, a program of dispossession, terror, and violence would be implemented on the people already living in the East. Language plays a significant role in total war. Labeling certain groups as different makes it easier to commit acts of violence against them. That was certainly the case in Poland, where it was the one-to-mention, as the Germans referred to them, who would be subject to resettlement, evacuation, or Germanization. We know, for example, that if you frame violence as conducted against individuals who are given very visual, humanized representation, people will find that violence very morally troubling. If, on the other hand, you use a collectivized frame, so you just talk about people as groups, or you even talk about them, as was done a lot in World War II, euphemistically. If you do that, people are much less troubled morally. They sense psychologically the reality of violence much less easily. So consequently, the way in which we describe these terms are very important. In practice, those implementing the plan knew it could mean the death of millions. The destruction of existing towns and villages would provide a blank canvas. Those who were deported were given mere minutes to gather what essentials they could and leave home, a home that had sometimes been in the family for centuries. They were shoved into unheated railway cars, sometimes beaten, sometimes shot. The general plan reveals the brutality of policy and bureaucracy in war. Germany was not alone in exploiting the resources of occupied lands. Japan had implemented a very similar system in its invasion of the Chinese region of Manchuria in 1931. Like Germany, in Japan, the push for living space motivated a program of relocations. Poor Japanese farmers were resettled from rural Japan to Manchuria. As with the German planners, those planning the Japanese relocations promised an idyllic lifestyle for those who moved. The Japanese policy was known as the settlement of 1 million households. The conquest of Manchuria doubled the size of the Japanese Empire. The plans differed in the methods used to remove the indigenous farmers from the land. Where the Germans considered annihilation of the population a viable option, the Japanese undervalued the land and paid unfair compensation to indigenous populations to move on. The scheme was not successful. Industrial expansion and the immigration of rural laborers to Manchuria exacerbated labor shortages back in Japan. In preparing for war, Japan recognized the need for resources to fight total war. Again, if you're going to wage total war, you need factories, you need food supplies, you need stability. In a sense, thinking about total war particularly drives the Japanese army's desire for continental spaces, continental resources. Throughout the war, Japan exploited the resources of occupied lands to feed the war effort. Japanese soldiers were expected to live off the land. In the US military in the Pacific, each combat soldier was supported by 18 logistical, medical, and other personnel. In the Japanese military, the ratio was 1-to-1. In the occupied territories, of course, they see Southeast Asia as their rice basket, and they try to pull out as much rice as possible. And in places like what's now Vietnam, the army go into the villages and requisition the rice, and then either feed the soldiers actually stationed there and also put it in warehouses to send back to Japan, but also to other Japanese troops stationed all around the Pacific, where it rots.
because of course there's not enough shipping to take it anywhere. Meanwhile, the villagers who have been absolutely stripped of foodstuffs. When Japan invaded French Indochina in July 1941, the United States imposed a trade embargo. This created a potential oil crisis as Japan purchased virtually all of its oil from the U.S. Japan sought to solve this issue by drawing oil from its occupied territories, but faced difficulties transporting it to Japan unimpeded. Other valuable economic resources acquired during the Japanese advance included Malaya's tin and Melandra and Southeast Asia's rice fields. Occupying forces sought more than arable land, resources, and living space from the defeated nations. Labor is vital to the conduct of total war, and occupied populations proved to be an attractive source of labor to the Axis war effort. The use of slave labor in Germany in the Second World War represented the culmination of total warfare that began with the tentative use of compulsory labor in the First World War. Prominent Nazi Fritz Saucke had served as a seaman during the First World War and was captured and held as a prisoner in France for the remainder of the war. In World War II, the coin of fate turned. As chief commissioner for the utilization of manpower, Saucke was responsible for depriving civilians in occupied territory of their liberty so that they may work for the benefit of the Reich. The work of prisoners of war also fell within his purview. Saucke was ultimately tried at Nuremberg and hanged for his crimes.
The policy of forced labor was introduced quite quickly. The concept of Blitzkrieg permitted the Germans at the beginning, once it invaded the country, to immediately incorporate all economic resources into the German economy. In other words, the more German-occupied territories, the stronger their war economy. But from the beginning, there was a major problem in the German economy, which was the demand for labor. Millions of civilian foreign laborers were forced from their homes to contribute to the German war effort. Italy, allied with Germany, also sent thousands to work in the Reich. They worked in agriculture, mining, manufacturing, construction, and on railroads. The so-called recruitment of workers could be brutal. Houses and villages were set alight when volunteers weren't forthcoming. People were captured and held in monasteries and schools until transportation to Germany. At the beginning, they tried to encourage them to volunteer. That didn't work. Then they gradually introduced more and more terroristic measures. They reduced their unemployment benefits, and then from 1942-43 onwards, they introduced harsh policy: arrest, roundup, forced deportation, and sending these forced laborers to Germany. At the end of 1944, there were some 8 million forced laborers working in Germany, which amounted to 1/3 of the entire labor force. The use of Polish civilian labor in German industry was a traumatic one. There were striking differences between forced laborers from Western Europe. They were somewhat better treated than those recruited from Poland and the Soviet Union. In most cases, Polish forced laborers were marked with the insignia of P, which stands for Pole. The use of Jewish forced labor was also widespread, and often Jewish forced laborers were worked literally and intentionally to death. As losses mounted, Germany turned to France for its labor needs. In 1942, Hitler demanded 350,000 workers from France. Germany needed France to fight its total war. It needed its agriculture, its industry, and its labor. Initially, they came up with schemes to encourage French workers to work in Germany, offered a system of relief, as they called it. So if France sent a certain number of workers to work in Germany, then Germany would release a certain number of French prisoners of war. In 1940, in those 6 weeks in which France fought but lost the war, Germany took 1.5 million French prisoners, and it kept them essentially as hostages to encourage cooperation. The Vichy government was inclined to agree to German demands, or in some cases act in anticipation of them. Power was very complex in Vichy. The Vichy government and elements within it who were more pro-collaborationist than others pushed to give more and more to the Germans as the war went on.
The Germans also demanded more, and in order to hold on to the scraps of power that it retained, the Vichy government cooperated more and more with what the Germans wanted. When the scheme to release prisoners in exchange for labor failed, the Vichy government implemented a more drastic plan. The big change comes at the beginning of 1943. They passed a law called the Compulsory Service Law, STO, and all young men of military age, that is to say, age around 20, are eligible to be taken off to Germany to work in the factories there. Initially, it works quite successfully, but increasingly, young men refuse to go. Some of them take to the hills and mountains, and they become what's called the Maquis, the kind of rural guerrilla force that is sort of mobilized at the moment of the Allied landing. Hitler was initially hesitant to employ Soviet labor, fearing both sabotage and a racial threat to Germany, but the shortage of labor forced his hand. The first Soviet workers and prisoners of war were shipped to Germany from early 1942. Forced laborers from the Soviet Union wore markings and signed with the initial O as the Eastern workers, and they were subjected to a very harsh policy of racial suppression. Thousands died, and most of them, if not all, were incarcerated in concentration camps or forced labor camps, which were set up often by German industrial firms. There were altogether some 30,000 forced labor camps in Germany, confining and exposing forced laborers to a terroristic policy. Regardless of nationality, hunger was an ever-present aspect of life for those who were forced to work for the Reich. Squalid, bug-infested living conditions fostered illness, but the experience and the levels of violence varied depending on location, the size of a camp, religion and gender, and Nazi categorization. Like Germany, Japan also looked to occupy territory to maintain its total war labor force. After the bombing of Pearl Harbor in December 1941, the Japanese advanced quickly across the Pacific. Within a matter of months, Malaya, Hong Kong, Singapore, the Philippines, and the Dutch East Indies had fallen to the Japanese. In occupying these territories, Japan found labor for their total war. Conscripted laborers, ramusha as they were known in Japanese, worked in coal mines, constructed airfields, built railroads and ports. They endured heat and beatings, illness and other privations. Perhaps one of the best-known projects on which they worked was the Burma-Thailand Railway, a construction scheme on which Allied prisoners of war also worked. Hundreds of thousands of Southeast Asian laborers are estimated to have died. The exact figure will never be known. They are what one historian calls the uncounted dead of the war. Between 200 and 400 women, dubbed comfort women by the Japanese, were forced into lives as sex slaves. These Chinese women, they'd been taken with the soldiers, they'd been forced to accompany the troops in an obvious capacity. Total war, by its very nature, draws civilians into its orbit. Some who could endure the occupation of their country no longer, or fought against Nazi forces from within Germany itself, stood against the tide of war. In Asia and the Pacific, there was also resistance to Japanese occupation. In some cases, this resistance was not limited to the Axis forces, but extended to resistance against colonial powers that undertook guerrilla attacks against Japanese forces. In Vietnam, from late 1943, when the Japanese surrendered, the Viet Minh continued their fight for Vietnamese independence from France. In France, the resistance movement took many forms. Some resistance was passive. This might be as small an act as reading an illegal newspaper. Others listened to BBC broadcasts or ignored anti-Jewish legislation. More explicit and more dangerous expressions of passive resistance included refusing to hand over individuals to the occupying power. In many ways, it was determined by external factors. Did you have an opportunity to resist? You might also ask what resistance actually was. If you're turning around road signs when the Germans are driving through, is that an act of resistance? In many ways, it is. If you're talking about active resistance,
Resistance, though, that's quite different.
It's estimated that only 1% of the population were engaged in active resistance. Active resistance was equally varied. It might be gathering intelligence, distributing Allied propaganda, rescuing downed Allied pilots, carrying out acts of sabotage or even assassinations. Then there's underground or clandestine resistance, which is secret, which is dangerous. The first thing they're trying to do is to send intelligence to the Allies, so there are little networks of people, some with radio transmitters, tracking where the German troops are, what the movements are, what the movements of their ships are on the Atlantic coast, and trying to get those messages to the Allies. These were courageous and highly dangerous acts. Those who carried them out risked not only their own lives, but also the lives of family members who may be targeted in retribution. For example, in 1944, as some of the SS units were retreating from southern France back towards Germany, resistance attacks on those units led to massive reprisals. In the town of Toul, the Germans selected all 400 male inhabitants. They hanged 97 of them from every single lamppost in the village, and the remainder they deported. Reprisals as a result of resistance activity were not limited to those who committed the act of resistance. In the summer of 1941, a communist takes a shot at a German officer, and then all hell breaks loose. Because, the Germans start to round up people and they exercise collective reprisals in a very brutal way, and that's very divisive. De Gaulle actually says, "I will tell you when the moment comes to resist in this way, but it's not now." Resistance existed within Germany as well. Hans and Sophie Shaw were among those who carried out active resistance in Germany and paid the price. Leaders of the White Rose Circle, they were caught distributing flyers condemning the Nazi regime. Hans and Sophie were convicted of high treason and beheaded. Hans was 24, Sophie 21. They were among thousands convicted and executed for treason in 1943 alone. The year Sophie and Hans were killed, 3,338 capital sentences were handed down by the People's Court in Berlin. Partisan war in Soviet-occupied territory was the epitome of total war. Neither side recognized a distinction between combatant and non-combatant. The Soviet Union expected its civilians to fight the People's War. So the Soviet partisans come in at least 3 variants. There are surrounded Red Army units who basically continue fighting behind the front. There are Communist Party and NKVD officials who basically in the last moment are told go underground and organize partisan resistance. Finally, there are also Red Army and NKVD troops who get sent behind the lines as diversionists in sabotage and scouting operations. So you have a variety of these armed groups who are lumped together as partisans, but who are organizationally quite distinct. For their part, the Germans were unrestrained in their treatment of suspected partisans. The army had suspended prosecution for crimes against inhabitants of occupied territories. In fact, in July 1941, Hitler noted the advantages of partisan war. It was an opportunity to annihilate all opposition. Retribution against partisan activities was brutal. Entire villages suspected of harboring partisans were burned, the inhabitants killed. In December 1942, over 5,000 civilians were killed in the region of Slonen. The Germans sought to exploit the resources of occupied territory for the war effort. The partisans did whatever was necessary to ensure they could not do so. Stalin demanded that partisans blow up bridges and roads, damage telephone and telegraph lines, set fire to forests, stores, and transports. There was no distinction between home front and battlefield. Both sides, occupiers and defenders, were fighting total war. Women undertook multiple roles in the partisan movement. As the armies of occupation advanced, their savagery against women served as a focal point for recruitment to the movement. As partisans themselves, women served as propagandists, saboteurs, scouts, and spies. Finally, fallen women partisans served a mythical role as martyrs for the total war propaganda effort. Partizanka Zoya Kuzmityaminskaya and Lisa Chikina were both caught, tortured, and killed as a result of their contribution to the partisan movement. Zoya, in particular, became a national icon after her death. She was, I would say, the Soviet Union's Joan of Arc. Her primary role, like a lot of these partisans, was actually to either harass enemy forces and/or, for example, apply scorched earth policies, burning huts and things to prevent the enemy getting hold of them. So Zoya Kozmityeminskaya was captured by the Germans and subsequently tortured and eventually hung. Details of her death were provided in both text and images to an unprecedented degree, but probably the most vivid and shocking image was her semi-naked, tortured body with atrocities committed on her corpse. The shocking nature of Zoya's death played into Soviet propaganda. In death, the Soviet Union made Zoya a martyr. The participation of women in the partisan movement is estimated at most 3%, but their incorporation into Soviet myth-making should not be underestimated. Total war impacts the lives of civilians in occupied countries in many ways, through targeted attacks on villages, retribution for resistance, and policies that intentionally displace or starve populations for the war effort. Siege warfare is another way in which war claimed the lives of civilians. Sieges are indiscriminate, blockading supplies to enemy forces and the civilian population equally. The siege of Leningrad is perhaps the best known of the Second World War. For close to 900 days, Leningrad endured a siege that has become infamous. A combined Finnish and German force blockaded the city. The people of Leningrad mobilized to defend their city, building anti-tank fortifications. But the greatest threat came not from the German tanks, but from the blockade, which prevented supplies reaching the town. What people are often unaware of is that the Germans had no intention, even if they had conquered Leningrad, of feeding that population. The plan was that you would lead them to starve to death anyway. A rationing system was put in place. Blue-collar workers, those who contributed to the industrial output, were allocated the most food. White-collar workers, the second largest share. Finally, the most vulnerable, the dependents, received the smallest. Refugees who had arrived from the Baltics and other countries received no rations at all. Bread made with sawdust shavings became a staple. In the depths of winter in January 1942, the food distribution system completely collapsed. For a week, ordinary people had no access to food. With no heating, electricity, light, or water in the city, the people of Leningrad endured minus 30 degrees Celsius temperatures, and cannibalism became almost commonplace. Reports were suppressed at the time, but in 2002, secret police files revealed that some 1,400 people had been imprisoned for cannibalism. Some relief came with supplies delivered by truck and sled across the ice road on Lake Ladoga in winter and by barge in summer. By 1943, the vegetable gardens that covered most of the open ground eased starvation-level rationing. An estimated 650,000 Leningravers lost their lives in 1942 alone. The siege of Leningrad revealed a number of elements of total war. The imperatives of mobilizing the civilian population to defend their homes, the effectiveness of the use of supply blockades to starve a population, rationing of food supplies. But the siege did not deliver total victory for Germany. The people held out. Their morale, remarkably, did not crack. A successful Soviet offensive ultimately ended the siege in January 1944. Few who lived their lives in the path of total war escaped untouched. For those who lived under occupation, the idea of home was either destroyed or profoundly changed. Not all who lived in occupied countries resisted the occupation. Some collaborated, and others sought to strike a balance of neutrality in a precarious situation. But occupation did not go unopposed, and as the Allies came closer to victory, partisan and resistance movements strengthened. Invasion and occupation disrupted and destroyed the lives of millions across the globe. Even for those who did not suffer occupation, total war meant that there was no guarantee of safety at home. German boots may not have been muddied with British soil, but Hitler was not beyond UK's reach. There was always the ever-present threat from above. From Sheffield to Shanghai, aerial bombing brought death and destruction on the lives of civilians in unprecedented ways. It was aerial bombing which demonstrated that no corner of the globe was free from total war fires.